Let me introduce our opening panel. And I'm really thrilled to have them. As I told you, when I first conceived this conference, there were three people originally that I had in mind. They're all going to be speaking at the conference. Lawrence Lessig will speak at the end. But to have Charles Murray and George Packer here is just an absolute honor and a privilege, and I think it's going to be an exceptional opportunity for all of us. Charles Murray is a political scientist, author, and libertarian. That's how he describes himself. He's been an AEI, American Enterprise Scholar, since 1990. He's written numerous books. I can't list them all. Three have been, I would say, disproportionately influential. Losing Ground was a book that largely led to the replacement of welfare with workfare, which has had an enormous influence, I should say, both on conservative and liberal thinking about welfare. The Bell Curve, which he co-authored with Richard J. Herrnstein at Harvard, which has been quite influential as well as very controversial. And Coming Apart, which is the most recent book, the one that I told you I read last year and made a deep impact on me. David Brooks of the New York Times writes that I will be shocked if there's another book this year as important as Charles Murray's Coming Apart. I'll be shocked if there's another book that so compellingly describes the most important trends in American society. So it's an absolute pleasure to have here Charles Murray. We'll wait and applaud at the end. George Packer is the author of the New York Times bestseller and National Book Award winner, The Unwinding, An Inner History of the New America. The New York Times writes about his book that the book is Steinbeckian in the best sense of that term. Packer has written something close to a nonfiction masterpiece. And I think those of you who've read it will agree. He's a staff writer for The New Yorker. He's won 3 Overseas Press Clubs awards. He's written many other books, The Assassin's Gate, American Iraq being one of the more important ones. He's also written 2 novels and a play. And he's an editor, something very dear to me, of the complete edition of George Orwell's essays. He's been a Guggenheim Fellow and a Holtzbrinck Fellow at the American Academy in Berlin. They will be our 2 speakers. They'll come up and each speak for about 15 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes, and then we're going to have a discussion. The discussants are from a wide range of backgrounds and political positions. I'll just, in alphabetical order, introduce them to you briefly. Drucilla Cornell is a professor of political theory, comparative literature, and women's studies and gender studies at Rutgers. She's also professor extraordinaire at the University of Pretoria in South Africa and is the director of the Ubuntu Project in South Africa. Her latest book is Law and Revolution in South Africa, Ubuntu, Dignity, and the Struggle for Constitutional Freedom. Philip K. Howard is the author of The Rule of Nobody, which came out this year and is a fascinating read. I will say that Fareed Zakaria calls it an utterly compelling and persuasive book that, if followed, could change the way America works. His TED Talk is very popular as well. 2 of our panelists have actually have the distinction of being on the Daily Show. Philip is one of them. The other is Zephyr Teachout, who's a constitutional property law professor at Fordham University. That's what her bio says. But as she would say it, I think she teaches about monopolies, antitrust. Her newest book, Corruption in America, From Benjamin Franklin's Snuffbox to Citizens United, is just out, and you must all read it. You may also have heard she ran for the Democratic Party's nomination for governor. And despite being outspent, but I think 1,02,520 to 1, took 36% of the vote. Is that right? Close? What? 34.5% of the vote. And the majority, I think, of counties or districts. And then finally, Kendall Thomas, who's the Nash Professor of Law, Director of the Center for study of law and culture and at Columbia University. Teaches constitutional law and civil rights. He's the co-founder, I just said that, I apologize. He's taught at many different law schools, and he was the inaugural recipient of the Berlin Prize Fellowship of the American Academy in Berlin. He's also the co-editor of Critical Race Theory, the key writings that formed the movement. This should be an exciting panel, and so to begin, please welcome Charles Murray. You want to come up here? Okay.
George and I have just had a small rebellion here. We've decided to sit down during our presentation because a couple of things. One is we have so many people on this panel that we want to give time to. And also this is supposed to be more of a conversation than a series of speeches. And I will try to be no more than 15 minutes max so we can increase the amount of time we can interact. George and I have about the same relationship to this topic as the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street had to it. I am a libertarian, and like the Tea Party, I get a lot of my energy from my animus toward big government. And a great deal, of course, from Occupy Wall Street was animus toward big business and finance and so forth. But the fact is, and I suspect that that gives George some of his energy as well. But the fact is that in both of cases, Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party, there is a sense that the game has been rigged. There has been a sense of separation of the elites from ordinary people, and a sense that something is deeply wrong structurally with what's going on in the United States. Both George and I have written about various aspects of this. I did both a discussion of the new lower class and of the new upper class in Coming Apart. I am going to focus on the new upper class in my remarks because George's book is such an evocative statement of some of the same things I would say, and I can join in later, adding perhaps some numbers to go with the characterizations that George will present. Okay, let's talk about the new upper class. New upper class is different from the upper middle class. It's a much smaller group. It's the people who run the country, if you want to think of it that way. The broad elite are the people who are the most important physicians and attorneys and college professors and television station owners in local cities. The narrow elite are the people who run the nation's politics and economics and culture. They are overwhelmingly located in just a very few centers. New York City and a surrounding area, Washington, D.C., its surrounding area, Hollywood, Los Angeles, and of course increasingly now in Silicon Valley, which is a whole new center of a major effect on both the culture and the economy of the United States. The thing I want to do in my few minutes is first to give you a quick sense of where the new upper class came from, because I don't think it's a problem that has been caused by government policy. I think it is a function of the way the world works and has worked over the last half century, and we aren't going to get rid of it by any of the ordinary, we aren't going to get rid of it, period. And then I will turn very briefly to my problems with the new upper class. How did it come about? Essentially, we had two broad phenomena go on during the 20th century, and especially the last half of the 20th century. The first of these was that cognitive ability, plain, simple old brains, became worth a whole lot more in the marketplace than it was before. Consider the case of somebody who has very high visual spatial skills that translate into such things as mathematical skills and also, by the way, programming skills, and has absolutely no social grace whatsoever. You would not trust this guy to go across the street and convince the guy at the 7-Eleven to sell him a loaf of bread. But he's really good at this arcane skill set. How could he make a living in 1920? He could be an actuary, basically. He couldn't even be a teacher of mathematics, really, if he has so little social skills. What can he do in 2015? Well, he has to start by juggling the offers from Google and from the quantitative hedge funds in New York City, because he is worth a fortune to them for that same skill set, and they don't care if he has any social skills whatsoever. But the same thing has gone on throughout the whole occupational structure. It makes a big difference how much money you're worth if you're an attorney. If what attorneys do is write wills and attend to the small, ordinary affairs of life, and they have individual clients who pay for these. And that's basically what lawyers did back in the 1920s and 1930s. And corporate lawyers made corporate salaries, which are good, but didn't make them fabulously wealthy. If you have a situation in which you have an international merger of companies that involves billions of dollars, and you have the ability to negotiate that incredibly complex job, you are worth a commission of a couple of $1 million to do that. If you can navigate the labyrinth of Washington bureaucracy, you can make a difference to the bottom line of a corporation if you can get a regulation worded correctly that makes you worth 4 figures an hour. Same thing is true of all the other ways in which the economy has simply just gotten much bigger, and the amounts of money that is worth it to a company to pay for a combination, of course, of creativity and imagination and perseverance and all these other things which are also important. I'm not saying IQ is the only thing. I'm saying if you are lucky enough to have that really high IQ, you make a lot more money than you used to. The second thing that went on was a good thing, which is that the country got much better at identifying academic talent wherever it was and shipping it off to really good schools. It happened in a decade that seldom gets credit for this kind of thing, the 1950s. And I will give you a specific example of how dramatic it was. I will use my alma mater, Harvard. The incoming class of 1952 had a mean SAT verbal score of around 578. Everybody in this room knows exactly what 578 means in verbal. It's nothing you write home about. And by 1960, 8 years later, the mean... by 1960, just 8 years later, the mean SAT verbal of the incoming Harvard freshman class was in the high 600s. There had been a full standard deviation change. The average incoming Harvard freshman in 1952 would have been in the bottom 10% of the class in 1960. That was a conscious decision, and it was a good decision to translate Harvard from being a place which had a lot of rich kids, some of whom were smart, to a place which had a whole lot of really, really smart kids, some of whom were rich. And it happened in the other Ivies. It happened also in the state universities, where by this time the honors programs in the big state universities are essentially competitive with the Ivies in terms of the skill level of the students there. That's good, but what it did, like so many good things, is it had collateral effects. And one of those was it brought together, as never before, academic talent at the same time that the economy was becoming more high-tech, in the same time you had many more jobs that called upon these kinds of skills, and you started to form a new culture in a way that a new culture didn't exist before. I'm not going to get through nearly as much as I wanted to, but I'll stick with this. And the result of that was that you had different ways of living. Well, I'll give you an example. The average TV in the average household in the United States is on 36 hours a week. Among the new upper class, the television is hardly on at all, and some of them will say to you, actually, we don't even have a television. And if they do have a television, they use it to watch movies or maybe Downton Abbey and Mad Men. And that's about it. Breaking Bad, if they're really kind of at the outer edge of the new upper class. That's a huge difference. It's not to say that everybody should watch 36 hours a week. It is to say that the new upper class is completely out of touch with a popular culture that they never even see. In coming apart to try to convey to my readers the extent to which they are isolated from the rest of American life, I had a quiz. 25 questions. You could get a maximum of 100 points. The higher your score, the less you were in a bubble. Low score meant you were really in a bubble. It had some good social science questions like, have you ever lived for at least a year of your life in a neighborhood where half of your neighbors did not have a college degree, half or more? But it also had other questions such as, have you or your spouse ever purchased a pickup truck? Or have you or your spouse ever purchased a mass market American beer? The disdain of the new upper class for beer, for Budweiser and Coors and Miller is palpable. If their beer has not been brewed by Belgian elves, they just won't drink it. And if I were going to say, what are the most important questions in this test? A couple come to mind. One of them is, have you ever walked on a factory floor? Not have you worked in one. Have you even seen one? Everything we use every day, just about, has been made in a factory. What does it say if you haven't any idea what a factory floor smells like, looks like, the noise, the rest of it? And the other question, if I'd say, what's the most important question in the test? It is, have you ever held a job that caused a body part to hurt at the end of the day? Carpal tunnel syndrome doesn't count in that. You have to have at least your feet aching. Better if something else aches. For a great part of the American population, having something hurt at the end of the day after work is something that happens every working day of their lives. To have never experienced that is, in important sense, not to be able to empathize with their lives. This kind of cultural isolation is now magnified by the degree to which the new upper class has clustered together. These great bubbles in which you have contiguous zip codes that are in the very outer reaches of socioeconomic status has been remarkable. Take Washington, D.C. A lot of you know Washington, D.C. Almost everybody who's a mover and shaker in Washington lives in Northwest Washington or McLean, Virginia, or Bethesda, Chevy Chase, or Potomac. That's basically where they all live. There are 13 zip codes. I ranked all the zip codes in the country in a combination of education and income. And of those 13 zip codes, 11 of them are not only in the top 1% of all zip codes in the country, they are in the top half of the top percent, and the others are right behind. And then they are surrounded by zip codes that are in the top 3, 4, 5%. Overall, there are 1 million people in contiguous zip codes in the Washington, D.C. area, contiguous zip codes that are in the top 5 centiles of zip codes in the country. And similar things happen in New York and Los Angeles and other big cities. It bespeaks an isolation which is really scary. I am not going to get at all to my critique of what's wrong with the new upper class and why it's a danger, but just let me conclude by saying this. In the past, we were rescued from a lot of the problems by the fact that people had grown up in a small town. They'd grown up in a working class neighborhood in Boston or Philadelphia. They still remember what that's like, even after they live in the Upper East Side of New York. We now have increasingly coming to power, and it will continue to get worse, people who have been born into the bubble. They've gone to good K-12 schools, probably private, or else really good public schools. They've gone from there seamlessly to selective colleges like Bard. During the summers, they have not worked construction. They have gotten internships at the New Yorker and at AEI, internships being affirmative action for the rich. And after that, they have gone from there to law school or to public policy schools or whatever, and then into their continuing in the bubble. They have no idea what the rest of America is like. And to summarize what I would have said about why this is scary, America is premised on the idea that you don't get too big for your britches, that you are prouder of being an American, and you identify more with being an American than being part of any socioeconomic class. That is now changing, and the catastrophic consequences of that, I think, can hardly be exaggerated. I'll stop there.
First, Roger, I have to correct you. I think 3 of us have been on The Daily Show, and I only mention it. Oh, I thought you were on The Daily Show.
No,
3 of us. And I only say it because it was the high point of my life, and you you can't take it away from me. I also want to say that two young women here are daughters of close friends of mine, and their mother made me promise that I would leave them with some hope. So I'm gonna do my best. Although, given our topic and given what we're talking about, it's a challenge. Charles Murray in earlier years had a reputation in circles I traveled in of being kind of a prince of darkness of the social sciences, and so it's his title is coming apart, but Charles Murray and I are coming together because there's a tremendous amount of overlap in what his book is about, what my book is about, what he just said, what I believe, and what I'll talk about. So it's not all atomization here. I spent a few years traveling to different parts of the country after the financial crisis and the election of Obama, feeling that we were in one of those moments of some historic transformation. It turned out not to be quite as historic as it promised. Among them were Youngstown, Ohio, a very hard-pressed old, dead really, not dying, dead steel town in Ohio. Rockingham County, North Carolina, tobacco and textile country, which have also begun to disappear, if not entirely, and Tampa Bay, which was one of the epicenters of the housing boom and then of the housing bust. And rather randomly, because I'm not a social scientist, I'm a journalist, I met people, talked to them, and kept going back and spending weeks and months getting to know them and following them to see what was happening in their lives. And so a few things that kept coming up in every place, in all of these places. One, I kept hearing there's no more middle class here. There's just rich and poor. And really what they meant is there's just poor, because it was hard to identify who the rich people were in some of these places. Tampa Bay is a little bit of an exception. Two, people were alone. I mean, in some ways, alone in the sense that they lived alone. They didn't have spouses. Some of them didn't have children. Every one of the major characters in my book is pretty much on their own, both in terms of family and in their sense of whether there's any support out there for them. So you mentioned institutions earlier, Roger. Is there a civic association? Is there a church? Is there a union? Is there a newspaper? Is there a government agency? Is there a business, a company that they can count on to realize the middle class aspirations that Charles's book begins with, and that these people say have faded away? No, they were all making it up on their own as they went along, without any conviction that if they failed or if they needed support somewhere, they could turn to an institution, a local. I don't mean a global. I mean a local institution to give them guidance, to give them information. Media were also in some ways missing from their lives. They had all the world's information at their fingertips, but they had no reliable source of information, let's say. No local newspaper that basically cared about the issues that they cared about and that reported on them in a useful way, because the media for them was either cable news or websites, and both of these had been given over entirely to national issues and to partisanship in a way that was, inflamed them, and they had their allegiances, but it wasn't useful to them. It didn't help them navigate their own lives. Third thing was corruption, which I guess we'll be talking about a lot. They felt that business and government were in a collusion together, that the game was rigged, and that it shut them out, that you had to be the right person, have the right amount of money, know the right people, be in the right place in order to make policy work for you, and that it wasn't working for them because they were out of it. And fourth, if they did have children, they felt that their children would not do as well as they were doing, which was saying something because they weren't doing all that well. And it also said that, there are lots and lots of ways to define the American dream, but certainly that's one of them. And that was missing. And polls showed that something like 75 to 80% of Americans now say that their children will not do as well as they are doing, which is I think a pretty dramatic reversal of the polling results of earlier years. And so the question really is, what our topic is American values, and what are the values that are threatened by this state of affairs? Let me just say a little bit more about each of these people. One is a woman named Tammy Thomas, a black woman in Youngstown, who in a way is a Youngstown success story, because having had every card dealt against her, mother, heroin addict, father, not around, brothers in jail for pretty serious drug and gang offenses. Youngstown itself, steel industry disappeared almost literally overnight. Like in 5 years, 50,000 jobs in a rather small area were gone in the late 70s and early 80s. So, and this was when Tammy Thomas was just leaving high school. You would think, this is a death sentence. And in fact, Youngstown became, Murder City and arson capital of America. She got one of the last good jobs, which were jobs that by then were mainly going to women. They were not jobs that the men from the mills who had done the really hard industrial work were getting. It was going to single mothers like her, because she had 3 children. She dealt 3 cards against herself by having 3 children without much means to support them. She then went to work on an assembly line at an auto parts factory just outside Youngstown, and that for 20 years allowed her to raise her kids and get them educated in. She had to keep moving because the blight kept following her. So she went from the east side of Youngstown to the south side. She went from the south side to the north side, one step ahead of catastrophe. And her kids all graduated from high school. They all went to college. They did not join the gangs. They did not get pregnant in high school. And they're all now doing really well, not in Youngstown. They're in North Carolina and Florida. Because Youngstown didn't seem to have a future for them. In the middle of her life, Tammy's, the floor underneath her disappeared. The job disappeared. The thing that allowed her to, along with her own character, which is really something to talk about, as she would put it, I would ask her over and over, how did you do this? And she said, I just did what I was supposed to do, as if it was the simplest, most obvious thing in the world, whereas I wanted to say, no one does what they're supposed to do. The job became part of a strategic bankruptcy on the part of Delphi Auto Parts, which shut down its North American operations, Canada, the U.S., tore up its contracts, and moved all the remaining jobs, because many of them were already gone, to Mexico and other low-wage destinations. That was it. Those were the last jobs in Youngstown. And she got back up on her feet and went to school to get a degree and became a community organizer. And that gave her a whole new, more, I would say, analytical perspective on Youngstown. It's interesting. She said to me that throughout her life, she had simply blamed other people for their own problems. And she felt rightly so. You screwed up. You didn't do what you were supposed to do. Very, willing to cast moral judgment and accurately. But being a community organizer also showed her that there were these larger forces, such as a company simply leaving because it could get a better deal in Mexico, that in some ways drove people into bad decisions that worsened a situation that was already difficult. So she's a remarkable woman, and in a way hopeful, because I would say her story is about not giving up. It's about being rooted to a place, even a place that was dying around her, and about, in the middle of her life, reinventing herself, which is something Americans, I think, are pretty good at, because we expect to have to, and becoming an activist, becoming someone who actually took agency of the problem she saw, rather than simply trying to fend them off. Dean Price is the second major character. He's a small businessman in rural North Carolina, and he too had a reckoning in midlife. The book kind of comes to a head right around 2006, 7, 8, when lots of things are collapsing. And his was that this chain of truck stops that he owned on Route 220 between North Carolina and Virginia began to go under with with housing prices dropping, financial crisis, and with competition from Walmart, Exxon, Sheets Oil, multinational competitors who could undercut him. And so he decided to go into biodiesel. And this meant making the fuel he sold out of canola oil and cooking oil, which is sort of an obvious thing in parts of the country where people wave the word bio as a flag of honor of the new upper class. In his part of the country, it was revolutionary and took a lot of convincing of others to sign on to. And he did not do well. He was bankrupt. His partnership ended. This is a story of a guy who was flat on his back several times and kept getting up. But it's not, I don't want to make it an optimistic story because it's really a story of someone who came very close to defeat. He's still at it. So there is something about persistence in these stories that I hope is a lifeline to think about. And it's persistence where they are. It's very much about fixing things right where they stand. Tammy and Dean have lots of ideas about the world and the federal government and America, but they're not acting as if they have to solve all the world's problems at once. They're really focused on vacant housing in Youngstown or on the collapse of the tobacco economy in North Carolina and what they can do to try to raise their community out of it. And I think that's something that might be happening in a lot of places that we're not even hearing about yet, where people have given up on the big power centers. They don't expect Washington to come up with solutions. They don't expect even Silicon Valley, which promises, shiny new things to all of us, to come up with solutions, or the media, or big business. It's very much about the place where they live and their own rootedness to it. And just to finish, the third main character is a Washington insider, former Joe Biden Senate aide who became disenchanted with Joe Biden when he turned out not to be a particularly nurturing boss, and also with government. And he did what everybody in Washington does. He went through the revolving door and became a multimillionaire lobbyist. And as he said to me, because he's incredibly brutally candid about this, there are lots of people like me around Washington who you've never heard of who are making millions of dollars simply because they once served in government. In fact, a lot of them serve in government in order to go through the revolving door. And in fact, I think some people run for office in order to serve out their respectable 3 terms and then go into the private sector and make millions of dollars. So that's Jeff Connaughton's story, except that like the other two, he has a moment of reckoning. And I want to suggest that these are good moments. They may seem like crises. 2008 was a crisis year, but I think it also, like a crisis in one's own life, has beneficial possibilities. You see yourself as you are. The illusions start to fall away. I think the past few years, books like Charles's, illusions are dropping. People are being forced to look in the mirror of America and to see what we are now. And all 3 of these people did that in their own lives. Jeff Connaughton became sort of disgusted with lobbying. I have to say it was partly because he lost a lot of his net wealth in the financial crisis, so there was an element of self-interest. He went back into government thinking that what he was going to do, he became chief of staff to the senator who took Biden's seat when Biden became vice president. He said he thought he and Ted Kaufman and others in the Senate would enact really sweeping Wall Street reform. And in his view, it didn't happen. And essentially, he retired. He I don't think we've heard the last of him, but he's living in Savannah, Georgia, and wrote a memoir and burned every bridge, which is a wonderful thing because people in Washington never do that. They always keep themselves viable. They write an op-ed that's scathing, but they don't name any names. He named every name. and he allowed me to name the names. So it's a picture of what's happened to Washington as a place that's just become about sustaining itself and about the revolving door. But he's the most cynical of the three. And that I think it's partly because he tried to take it all on. He tried to change Washington and to change the country through big national legislation. And that doesn't work these days. So I'm most hopeful when I'm thinking about Tammy and Dean, who've kind of had the hardest time of it. The book also has a Silicon Valley element. Peter Thiel, the founder of PayPal, is in it. And I guess all I would say about that is out there, you feel as if you're living in a completely different America because everything is working and money just seems to appear overnight. And those socially graceless 24-year-olds, sell their company to Facebook and become billionaires. And it's a kind of magical place. It's utterly, I mean, if you think there are bubbles in New York, Washington, Seattle, Denver, whatever, Silicon Valley is the ultimate bubble. A question I asked people out there was, why is the age of the information revolution coincided almost exactly with the age of ever-growing economic inequality? Just a question, like, do you think there's a relation? Has it, contributed? Has it failed to stop it? It's not that they had an answer. They'd never thought of that question and I think it's because it just doesn't impinge on them. Peter Thiel's a bit different. He's a hardcore libertarian who's quite aware that Silicon Valley has failed to solve our problems. And I guess one reason is we have two problems. One is bigness. Walmart, which comes into Rockingham County, 3 Walmarts in this tiny little rural county in North Carolina. The Dean prices in Rockingham County cannot make a business work. And the other is atomization and the electronic town hall meeting and everyone having their own reality from their own collection of favorite websites. And I think Silicon Valley has contributed something to the latter. So neither of those really creates a space for the kind of engagement that Roger talked about in his introduction. So I'll stop with that.
So thank you, both Charles and George. You have to update your bio because it doesn't have the Daily Show on your bio. Everyone else puts it on their bio. So we have about an hour for questions. The 4 panelists are going to ask the questions. I will take questions from the audience. You can also tweet questions to the Arendt Center with the hashtag ArendtCon. This is the new world. If you prefer, and we'll also take some questions. But I'm first going to ask our 4 wonderful discussants to each pose 1 or 2 questions to George and Charles, and we'll get going. Do you want to lead off, Drucilla, Cornell?
Yes, thank you, Roger. I'm very honored to be here. Like you, George, I never expected to be on a panel with Charles Murray. In fact, I oftentimes think of you as a specter. I taught targeted groups in the SATs, determined to show you wrong, and succeeded. I taught in the affirmative action program at Newark, determined to take people who didn't even have high school degrees, get them all A's in law school, something I believe everybody can do. Continued to tutor women students in law school how to knock those exams right out of the ballpark, succeeded in that. So always you were on my mind. But my question today, and I worked as a dye sorter in Silicon Valley. I worked in the auto factories, and I was a grade A welder. And that led to a problem, which was a major misunderstanding with men. Men would ask me, will you give me a blowjob? And I thought they wanted me to melt metal. And only recently, my teenage daughter said, they didn't want you to go get your blowtorch, Mom. And I thought, no wonder they seem so confused. So my factory experience actually led to a lot of richness. Obviously, Kendall's writing on race has been so influential in my life. I was fighting racism every step of the way. But my question to Charles Murray is about marriage, because here we're on the same page. 1963, my father tries to convince me that a condom is a balloon and that he and his friends were having a balloon party while we were vacationing. Now, I grew up in a world of philandering men and women accepting it. Betty Friedan, 1963, and everyone lies. She meant the men, but she also meant the women because they said that there was nothing you could do about philandering, so you denied it. Now, unlike John Adams' worry about infidelity, I went on a moral path to find out if I could salvage marriage, get men back to fidelity. And I found Hegel. Now, once I'd found Hegel, Hegel argues that you have to have reciprocal symmetry between men and women. That meant equality. That meant feminism. And then I found Mary Wollstonecraft. You have to educate men, but only women of true equality with you can ever be your equals and can ever be the ones you stay with. And therefore, you won't sexually objectifying them because there will be that I on the other side. And so my solution when I dated, and you know what it's like, I don't think they still call it first base. You're at a movie, some guy's trying to slide in, right? And you're trying to watch the movie. You can't even eat your popcorn. Then he's trying to go for second. You know, it's like ridiculous. You're a baseball field. So I said to my grandmother, the answer is she was the first woman president of a printing company. Very much along your lines, George, about always teaching me working class lessons. Tip 3 times the going rate, et cetera, et cetera. So I said to my grandmother, I think the solution to men, infidelity, dating, and marriage is Hegel. She said, well, that's a possibility, so let's print out some Hegel excerpts. So every day when the man started sliding around, I said, I'm going home now. My grandmother also said never get in a car with a man, and fortunately gave me my own car, so I didn't have to. And so I would leave a dime and then leave his Hegel excerpts, and then he had to take a test if he wanted a second date. Now, my question to you as a Tea Party member, all this is about feminism to me, because until men see women as truly equal and give them fully equal rights, I don't think we're ever going to get back to having anything like meaningful marriage. So my question is, let's have you become a feminist, and then we'll really be on the same side in the name of marriage. Now, George, I found your book deeply moving. And my question to you was twofold. You have two wonderful excerpts. I mean, the whole book is very fascinating to me. Some of the tragedies, some of the persistence, some of the attempts to hold on to values against all else. But you have a short vignette on Oprah Winfrey, where, as you say, she takes away all the excuses, right, in her magical thinking. So my first question to you is, how much is that magical thinking a way of justifying neoliberal capitalism? We haven't used the word capitalism yet. I think it needs to be out there because somehow or another, then it really is your fault. And then my second question is what I would call fabulistic storytelling. You have another wonderful fable by Elizabeth Warren, a 5-minute, I'm not saying that she didn't tell you this, I'm sure she did, has nothing to do with the truth of Elizabeth Warren's life, because Elizabeth Warren was a relentless opportunist to get into the new elite and became a Democrat. Once she was at Harvard, everybody was a Democrat. Campaigned against income security as part of the curriculum at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, campaigned against workers' rights as part of the curriculum at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, was anti-crit, anti-ACLU, was in bankruptcy, this she admits to show the scammers for what they are. Militant right-wing Republican, determined to turn Penn Law School into 100% serving the corporate law firms in the city. And then all of a sudden one day, she got to Harvard, she made it. And then one day she became a Democrat because everybody was a Democrat. I thought I must have Elizabeth Warren wrong, but my question to you is, since there's no accountability, the institutions, like say you're in a union, I was a union member.
Please ask the question.
Oh, you're accountable. You're accountable to unions. You're accountable to your union members. You're accountable for your life. When Elizabeth Warren's asked questions, she says she can't remember. So related to the first question is, how is fabulistic thinking, the ability to just make up a story about yourself, part of the collapse of institutions?
Okay. Charles, do you want to start with talking about, you need a mic. You need a mic.
I can't give you any social science data on philandering, but I think it's interesting to look at the different state of marriage in the upper middle class and in the working class. Basically, marriage is alive and well in the upper middle class. If you take whites ages 30 to 50, you have at this point about 84% of them are married. An increasing number of these are first marriages. And I would also submit to you that an awful lot of them are good marriages. Now this I can't, I guess I will ask the audience. I will tell you what my life looks like, and you think about your acquaintances. As I look around at our friends, including friends of a fairly wide age range, now I've been divorced in the past, but I've been married for 31 years subsequently. And a lot of our friends have never been divorced. They're in marriages, and an outsider never can be absolutely sure, but they look like really good marriages. And if you in the audience are thinking about your friends and saying, well, actually, most of the people I know are married and in pretty good marriages, I think that would be a positive thing. And I will also say, I think my wife will back me up on this, that I was going to say we're equal. She's actually smarter than I am. By that, I know a whole lot about IQ and psychometrics. I am not being a pleasant husband. I know for a fact she's smarter than me. So it's at least equality. I think in the upper middle class in this country, you've seen better and better marriages. Working class, whole different story.
Can you say a little bit more about the working class story?
Well, 25 to 50 years old in whites in the working class, 48% are married, compared to 84% in the upper middle class. And that's down from 84% in 1960. From 84% to 48% percentage married, that's a huge change. And the reason it's so important is that the nature of the family has so many reverberating effects. It has reverberating effects on the way communities are organized, has reverberating effects on these local institutions that you're talking about. You know, a school in which you have a whole lot of married parents has a completely different situation with parents and PTAs and all the rest of it than a school where you have single mothers trying to make time to do things. It's lots of reverberating effects of that collapse of marriage.
Great. George, can you talk to maybe the fabulistic thinking of Oprah?
Yeah, it's not just Oprah. It really pervades a lot of society, especially celebrity society. Jay-Z is a fabulistic thinker too. And in my book, Dean Price has his absolute hero is a guy named Napoleon Hill, who very few people have heard of anymore, but he was sort of the How to Succeed in Business, the original business writer who went around, supported by Andrew Carnegie, and asked every successful person in America how they did it, and then wrote a book about it. And he said famously, if the mind can conceive it and the heart can believe it, then you can achieve it, which Oprah had on her mirror in her dressing room at her first job in Baltimore. But it was attributed to Jesse Jackson. So it just shows how it's common. I mean, it's a sort of American philosophy. The mind cure is what it was called back in the late 19th, early 20th century. I think it comes to the surface and becomes most powerful when people feel that the normal, ordinary channels of upward mobility are blocked. So holding a job, educating your kids, watching them get a better job doesn't work anymore. I'm going to do what Jay-Z did. I'm going to sell crack. I'm going to put out my first CD, and I'm going to become, a member of the Forbes 400. Oprah says, and that's why I had that as the last line of the Oprah chapter, if black people look at Oprah, they realize there are no more excuses because I did it. And she did do it, and she did it through a tremendous talent and energy. But what it does is it denies the force of circumstances and of society. And just as one case study in my book, there's a family called the Hartzels. And whether it's neoliberal capitalism or something else, what happens in their life is they are a family of 4 in Tampa who do things, essentially most of the right things. The family stays together. They raise their children with tremendous love. The children are respectful. There's no drugs. There's no drinking. There's no beating. There's no philandering. So in some ways, they're moral paragons. In other ways, they've made huge mistakes, dropped out of high school. He supported the family as a welder for years, and then went to work in a packaging plant. And when those blue-collar jobs disappeared from Tampa, there was basically Walmart and Target. He took those jobs. They paid $8.25, $8.50 an hour. They were part-time. Of course, no benefits. The hours kept changing. He could never predict from week to week. And then they started getting reduced until they were like 20 or 25. And imagine trying to raise a family of 4 on $8.25 an hour, 20, 25 hours a week. And he would quit those jobs, or he'd walk off them, or he would say something, he'd mouth off to his boss and get fired. And those were catastrophic mistakes because the family fell into homelessness. And they lived in their car for months this year. So what does that say to you? It says, given certain circumstances, you make a few mistakes and there's no bottom. The fall will not be broken. And so that's a story of one family that is probably repeated, many, many times across the country.
Yeah. Charles, could I ask you to reflect a little bit on what George was just saying about the Hartzels? I mean, a lot of his book is about institutions and about the social circumstance. And one of the interesting conversations, I think, between you that we not yet having but could be had is you have a more individualist view, more that if you believe it and you do it and you take the job, you'll find meaning in your life. And even if you're only making $25 an hour, you still have a job and that's what you do. I'm wondering if you could just reflect on his story with the mic, and what your response. Could you pick up your mic? I know you need a mic.
My response is what they call conflicted. There's another story in the book which I lit on, where the couple, I'm not sure it's the same one, had lost all their teeth.
Same one.
That's the same one. And somehow they get new teeth. I mean, they got a complete set of
Medicaid.
Medicaid, okay. And they're fitted with teeth, and which is a big deal, and put in, but their mouths hurt, so they take them out and never put them in again. Now, that's a mistake. And you ought to live in a society where there are other people, not government officials, and not, there ought to be friends and family and the rest of it where they go home and said, oh, they hurt, so I took them out. And somebody says, are you crazy? Put those back in, in terms of getting a job and the rest, do this. And some of the other things they did. There was nobody around them, as far as I could tell, who was providing the kind of feedback which is a real safety net. I am not an individualist in the sense that I think everybody is on their own and should be inventing themselves de novo all the time without anybody's help. I am a great believer in the importance of little platoons as being the best possible way to deal with human needs. And it's the vanishing of the little platoons that I obsess about.
Okay. We're going to go in alphabetical order, and try and keep our questions short. Philip, can you go next?
I'd like to find my mic. I grew up in eastern Kentucky, and the best job you could get in the summers, or the highest paying job, was to work in the tobacco fields, which I did. It was $1 an hour. It's in the late 60s. And I determined when working the fields that when I grew up, I had an ambition, which was to have an office job, and I have succeeded in that. I got a 29 on your score in your book, by the way, which means I haven't lived that hard a life, but harder than some. The title of this panel is, do we have an idea of America that can inspire people to sacrifice for the common good? It's sort of a values related. And I kind of hear some of that in both of your books, which I loved and read long before this panel occurred. But I do think there is an idea of America, and I think it's part of it, which is partially a myth of the individual empowerment and the Oprah's mirror and all of that. A lot of it, though, is a real empowerment that they can get together in platoons or in communities and have a sense of ownership, that when they wake up in the morning, there's something they can do, not only support their family, but to make a difference. And I think that's, I think we're losing that value. The Robert Bellah conclusion in Habits of the Heart that freedom, people are redefining freedom in America as the freedom to be left alone rather than the freedom to do. It's a really significant problem. It's something that Hannah Arendt talked about a lot. And I think, I hope at least at some point, I'm going to throw this question, is that we should go there, which is when Roger talked about the kind of devolution of authority to higher bodies, I think that's true to an extent, but not nearly as true as the devolution of all authority, including by higher bodies, to bureaucracy, which is Arendt says, the last stage of the nation state, just as one-man rule was the first stage of the nation state. And I argue in my books and increasingly believe that that while corruption and money is all there and they preserve the status quo and everybody's feeding on it, there is a blob. And the blob is really not owned by anybody. It's not owned by Joe Biden. It's not owned by, it's just there. It prevents the president from rebuilding infrastructure. It prevents people from, the teacher from running the classroom, from being spontaneous. It prevents citizens from getting together, providing social services. It prevents people from doing what Americans in the little towns I grew up in and you grew up in always did, because we comply with the rules. So my question to you, and to these two, both of you have written about it, what is your take on the kind of formal structure of society and how that affects the Tammys and the Deans and the sense of community or lack thereof, and when you're talking about these polarizations, which I also agree with?
Well, I just finished yesterday sending in the final chapter of my new book to my editor, and the new book contains so much quotation from your stuff that I think I violated copyright laws.
Yes. Your book will sell better. Can I just have a cut?
and the thing you are alluding to, the blob, is the main topic here. So I'm kind of afraid to go on with the answer because I get into a rant. Yes, I think that we have, and I think of it in terms of the regulatory state, combined with all the ways in which the law has become such a complex monster that you write about, that there are all sorts of ways in which people could ordinarily cope in life, and they keep getting squashed down because they have run afoul of some rule, they have violated some regulation. The feds come out, or the state people come out and say, oh, no, you can't do that, and here's the fine you have to pay. Well, this is one thing if it's done to a corporation. You know, they have money, it's a problem, but they have people who can deal with that. When you have a guy who owns a little plant nursery, or he's a plumber, or something else like that, it's real easy to squash that guy. It's real easy to make life so difficult that he is not able to do a whole bunch of the things, whether it's in his own livelihood or in the community, that 50 years ago he could have done. I'll stop there. You pushed a button on that one.
Just very briefly, I mean, in a way, we all seem to be against big things, and maybe the breakdown between left and right these days is whether the big thing you put most of your energy into opposing is government or corporations, because certainly people's daily lives are also hugely affected by, and in some ways limited by, giant corporations that they don't even know the address of, and that don't have any loyalty or responsibility for the country, let alone that little community, because of globalization. But I'm going to leave it at that and just say what I really want to do is hear from some people in the audience, especially people, say, under the age of 24. I would love to know what this means to you, whether we're talking about something that just isn't the country you're living in because you're in school or you have been focused on getting into college, or because institutions are barred and barred seems like a good institution, or whatever. Just I want to hear from young people especially.
We want to do that. Yeah, we're going to just ask two quick, hopefully these quick questions, and then have time for questions from the audience. So Kendall, you're next. And we'll try and keep them moving. So try and be brief.
First, let me say that I'm very glad to be here and honored to be on this panel. Like Drucilla, I certainly would not have imagined when I got into this business that I would be on a stage in a conversation with Mr. Murray. It has an air of unreality about it, and it forces me to rethink and reimagine, in fact, in some fundamental existential way, who I think I am. Because panels like this, of course, are also constitutive, right? We're talking about ideas, but we're making ourselves up together. And so it is in many ways a measure of both the promise and the possibilities on one hand, and the deep structural contradictions that characterize intellectual life in the era of neoliberal capitalist democracy, if democracy is a word we want to use. I have a question for Mr. Murray, and I have a question for Mr. Packer, and you'll forgive me because in order to ask the question, I have to set the question up. I was born in East Chicago, Indiana, which is home of the Inland Steel Company. Most of the men in my family worked for Inland Steel. When I was 4, I was taken to California by my grandfather, who did not work for Inland Steel because he was a Baptist preacher and thus insulated from some of the pressures of the black working class that was his congregation. In 1974, I went to Yale College, and after Yale College to Yale Law School. And I graduated from high school the year that my mother, a single mother, graduated from college. She started out in a community college for 2 years and then went to California State University in Chico. I'm trying to, this is my question for Mr. Murray, because I think it's very important to complexify the picture of this so-called new middle class, of which I suppose I am too a part. And yet I could not hear myself in the narrative of who that middle class is in Mr. Murray's description, because I thought of the letter I read last night from my Uncle Paul, who in 1994 was arrested for attempting to rob the 7-Eleven in Oroville, California, where my family lived, in the very grip of the crack epidemic. He went to Folsom Prison and found out that he not only had HIV, but CDC-defined AIDS. I'm a gay man who lived through the worst years of the AIDS epidemic. I feel a connection to my Uncle Paul, notwithstanding the fact that I'm a member of the so-called new upper class. I think of my sister, Yvonne, who was one of the many, many thousands of African Americans who managed to claw their way into the American dream by buying a house. She lost her house, and she lost it before there was any possibility of holding on to it. Around the same time that I sold my first apartment in New York for $1.6 million. I feel a connection, nonetheless, to my sister, although in class terms we couldn't be more different. I think of the members of the congregation of the church to which my late aunt belonged in St. Louis. This church, a Baptist church, was the church in which the funeral of Michael Brown was held. I didn't know Michael Brown or his mother or anybody in his family, but I feel a deep connection to them. Mr. Murray said that America is premised on being prouder, on us being prouder of being American than being part of a socioeconomic class. But like C.B. McPherson, I think America is premised on the idea that we are a country of inequalities, but alongside those inequalities, they're fundamental equalities. The story of the Civil Rights Movement is a story in which that idea became true for people of color in the United States. The moment of neoliberal capitalism in which we live today is one in which that is less and less true, notwithstanding the fact that we have painted the White House black, in the words of a recent book. So my question to Mr. Murray is, how does the question of race complexify the story of the new upper class? My question for Mr. Packer is related, and it was suggested to me by his observation that 3 of us have been on The Daily Show. I think the fact that that matters to us collectively, it signifies, is a measure of the society in which we live, a society in which celebrity and celebritization is paramount, in which a figure like Kim Kardashian, who, so far as I can tell, has never actually done anything, could be a celebrity, right? And in which an Oprah Winfrey could delude herself into believing that the fact that the system chose her, right, to be an incarnation of the Horatio Alger myth means that everyone can succeed. But the president himself said before the NAACP that black kids who do not make their way upward have no excuses. I think that's a phrase he used. He has, for black Americans, been our scolder-in-chief. So my question for Mr. Packer, I suppose, has to do with the force of neoliberal capitalism, not as an economic factor, but as a factor which constitutes what Drucilla has called our imaginary domain, right? We used to imagine ourselves in relation to one another in very different ways than we imagine ourselves under consumer capitalism, where our primary identity is either as consumers or as entrepreneurs.
Right.
What is that shift in the way that people imagine themselves in our symbolic politics, to use the idea of Jacqueline Rose following Stuart Hall? What is that idea, that shift, that sort of paradigm shift that neoliberalism has brought about mean for the possibilities of this kind of reimagining of oneself, a remaking of oneself, of a kind of persistence and resilience that you talked about in the people
Right.
Who you profiled in your book?
Thank you. Charles, do you want to begin?
Well, I guess the first part of the answer is that you're not one of the members of the new upper class that I'm worried about, because you still remember what it was like in another America, a very different America from the one you live in right now. In the same way that somebody who now owns a chain of auto repair shops and is worth $30 million, but he did it because he grew up as a mechanic. He remembers what it was like. And the person who went to Yale Law School in 1974 in your same class, who was white, but who grew up in a working class home, he is also like you. And what I am worried about are the members of who are rising to positions of great authority in this country who don't remember any other America except the America in the bubble. So I am not being dismissive of race as a distinctive feature of your experience, but the aspect of your experience which is a strength is that you have lived in all sorts of different Americas and you still remember. So, race is important. It's still more important that you've had that multidimensional experience.
George?
If I understand your question, the way the people I spent time with identify themselves cuts all sorts of ways. Yeah, consumerism is a big one, and you could point to some foolish expenditures by people who didn't have the money to buy what they bought because they felt they had to in order to be minimal members of our society as one cost of consumer capitalism. Dean Price thinks of entrepreneurship as the highest good, and he reveres Steve Jobs. And if he knew who Peter Thiel was, he would revere Peter Thiel, who is in the book. And out in Silicon Valley, that is the religion. The religion is entrepreneurship. Although it has a way of quickly leading to fairly top-down corporate hierarchies once they succeed, because it turns out that Facebook is in some ways a more opaque and hierarchical company than IBM, even though the spirit of it, the ethos is we're all hackers here. You know, we're all just guys in jeans, and it is guys in jeans, staying up all night coding. So I guess in some ways the imagination is of, in many parts of the country and in many people, the lonely individual who is going to either make it or not. And the celebrity culture reinforces that 100 times, so that Steve Jobs represents business success. And it's a galvanizing force. I think it has a good side to it, which is that it fuels aspiration. And in Dean Price, it fuels resilience. Without that dream, the Napoleon Hill dream, Dean might be dead now by his own hand. But at the same time, I think it distorts the true picture, because although Dean has identified Walmart as evil and Steve Jobs as good, Sam Walton was Steve Jobs. I mean, he's another of the celebrities I profiled in the book. Sam Walton was a kind of a self-made American hero who became the face of this corporation. And until his death, Walmart was actually thought of as a great American story. It was after that folksy small-town face was gone, and very quickly, like within months, that all the negative stories about Walmart started to come out. So in a way, the self-made entrepreneur has a disguising effect on what a Walmart or an Apple or any number of other entities in the private sector are actually doing in the lives of someone like Dean Price.
So we're going to move on, have one question from Zephyr Teachout, and then we're going to have time for questions from the audience. So Zephyr, please keep it brief as we can.
Can you hear me? Yeah. I'm talking tomorrow, so you're going to get more than enough of me. George being on The Daily Show is also one of the highlights of my life. I studied it before I went on. I'm serious. So it seems to me that one of our potential, Charles, these are just beautiful and important stories, because if we're going to come together and decide what we want to do, we have to decide who we are. So this is constitutive, you're saying. But one of the sort of deep disagreements that we may have is about the nature of what a human is and about how differently abled people are. And my own understanding of the meritocracy, or of the sort of the elite, the current bubble, which is a very powerful vision you tell of this elite bubble, is that one of the psychological, I would think, flaws is its own belief in meritocracy as a functioning system. do you believe that outside the academy, but actually in those who hold power right now in American society, there's a meritocracy to select the true holders of power? And then for George, I have a quick question. It's an impossible question. I have a friend who made me ask real questions, so I'm asking a question I don't know the answer to at all, but do with it what you will. I don't know what it means to have an idea of America at any snapshot in time. But if you can say something about what is different now between now and 1986 or 1996, that where, this portrait of the political nature of isolation is so important. So I want you to stay away from the mechanical part, but move to the idea part. The idea of America that Price might have had 20 years ago and how that has changed. I'd love to hear some thoughts on that.
I don't use the word meritocracy for a reason. I avoid it because I like to believe that human beings can affect their own perseverance and their resilience and their industriousness and all sorts of things. And you'd have lots of psychologists who say, no, that's all driven by genetics and childhood experiences. But I like to think that human beings really can suck it up and do things like that. When it comes to this peculiar thing called cognitive ability that I referred to earlier, that's a pure gift. None of us earns our IQ. And so in that, and one of the things that bothers me the most about the new upper class that is increasingly the ones who have the super high scores on all these tests is they don't seem to understand that it's a gift that they should be humble about as opposed to being proud of. And so is the meritocracy, in quotes, working? Well, one way of saying is it working with regard to governance is, do we have the right set of people making decisions, in these positions? And my answer is no. And they're getting worse and worse because, as I put it in the book, it doesn't make any difference if a truck driver can't empathize with the priorities of a cabinet secretary. It makes a whole big difference if a cabinet secretary cannot empathize with the priorities of a truck driver. And I think we are increasingly ruled by people, I will put it real pejoratively, and I understand that I'm making a generalization for which there are many exceptions. There are a whole lot of people who think that they are smarter than ordinary Americans, and that ordinary Americans need their help in making the right decisions. And so it's okay to have the experts who make all these rules and stage manage people's lives, because you can't really trust ordinary people to know what's best for them. I see that attitude more and more commonly. I see it among academicians. I see it among graduate students in elite colleges. I see it among bureaucrats and elected officials. And pisses me off. I guess that's the best way to put it.
So I graduated from high school in 1978, and that's the year my book begins. And I'd say since then, to be very, very broad brush about it, our country has become more free and less fair. It's become more tolerant and inclusive, and also more stratified and exclusive. Maybe more socially equal and economically unequal, and less organized around those mid-level, maybe platoon or maybe company-sized or even battalion-sized entities, because I think there's a place for battalion-sized entities too, and more and more the lonely individual and the gigantic, distant corporation or government. But there's something else that may be a good transition to questions, which is that I think I see more idealism. When I graduated from high school, kids I knew and I myself were so cynical. our culture heroes were Richard Pryor, Saturday Night Live, the Ramones. It was a time of like utter disbelief in anyone who claimed to be doing things out of higher motives. And today I don't see that. I mean, I teaching and being around people in their teens and 20s, I sense a true spirit of voluntarism, of wanting to make the world a better place, of believing in joining a cause. And so the question is how that fits with all this decline we're talking about, and whether maybe the next generation is going to be able to atone for our sins.
Yeah, we got a little hope in, although their comedy seems to be the place where we go to have serious conversations. So we'll see if the irony of the comedy. I'm going to take questions from the audience. I'd like to have some students from who are, as we said, younger. So there's some mics that are going to be passed around. If you also want to tweet your question to ArendtCon #, you can. Why don't we first start a question right down here?
Nope, it is on. All right. I guess I should introduce myself. My name is Julian Labrizzi. I'm a student at Bard High School College, Manhattan. First off, to go off your point, I forgot your name. Nice job. George. About your point about wanting to make the world a better place and decline. I think what you said about atoning for your generation's sin. I am a high school. What? Sorry. Oh yeah, my bad. It's when I rant, I go like that. Anyway, it's almost like the atonement to our sins makes sense because its optimism almost comes from a point that almost out of desperation because as generations go by, we notice that since we have such a change in our society, that we notice okay, fine, the 1950s were a very, not incorrect time, because that's kind of weird to say, but it's a very almost, I can't have a word for this, but it's not a time that, it's not as socially advanced as our time is today. Now that goes into my point for you, Charles Murray. In your book, I read your book. I read the prologue in chapter 17 because that's what we were given from Professor. My teacher gave us a handout for it. Hi, Professor Cho. I know you're out there. I read your book, and one of the biggest problems I had with your book is that you only focus on one group, which is white upper-class Americans, and I understand why you did that. And I agree with your part about the blob. And my question to you is, what we were talking about earlier, Jeter, with the idea of super zips, and now certain neighborhoods have upper middle class live in a certain neighborhood and lower middle class live in other neighborhoods and stuff like that, along that kind of line. I'm kind of curious in the fact that why you didn't take the youth into effect and how education plays a role in how there's this sort of there's this sort of
let's keep the question at how do you keep the youth into effect?
Yeah. My question is, why don't you take into consideration the youth and how growing up in a different schooling district affects how youth see the world? And if they're only growing up where all their friends are white rich kids, then how do they see the world as opposed to someone who's gone to a more diverse and open school?
Okay. First, with the mic.
Having read the prologue in chapter 17 gives you 2 more chapters that you read than many reviewers have read of my books when they review them. Some of what you're asking about I do deal with elsewhere. Point number 1 is education has a huge effect on the composition of the new upper class, okay? And it's this sorting process, particularly in higher education, but that is increasingly going on in K-12, that is very powerful there. If your question, though, is, well, to what extent, if you had better educational opportunities, would you'd have more mobility? Was that what you were getting at in the question?
Kind of, but let me put it this way. How do you feel our society would be different if instead of having schools where, by neighborhood schools, by zone schools? Oh, all right,
actually,
thank you.
I can understand him better before he has the mic, but let's go ahead.
I know, this mic kind of adds a weird echo to my voice. But one thing I've noticed, because I've gone to schools in 3 different boroughs, which is pretty rare for students, is that by the time students get to high school, most of their friends are kids from their neighborhood who have the same beliefs as them, and that's kind of a product of the fact that from K to say 8th grade, you go to like a zone school in your neighborhood where all your friends are from your neighborhood, they all have the same, like they all live down the block from you. How would that be different if, say, you got kids from the Upper East Side going to kindergarten, elementary school with kids from like the Bronx?
Okay, great. I live in a small town in Maryland. I have been fascinated to watch as my children went through that school system. My daughter went off to Middlebury to go to college, all right? Because she came from a family where, I'd gone to Harvard, my wife had been at Yale, and so she was used to the idea of going off and doing something different. In her high school, you had lots of really, really smart kids who could have gone to any of those schools, could have gotten admitted if they'd applied, never crossed their minds to apply. I think for one of the reasons you're just saying, you're hanging out in a certain circle, it never comes into your radar that you have these options open to you. And I think it's partly a problem and partly not. It's a problem insofar as I would like to see a lot more of the freshman classes at the elite schools consist of people from high schools like the ones that near me, the one where my kids went. It's not a problem in this other sense. Going to Harvard or Yale or Bard in the grand scheme of things is not that big a deal. This is not the keys to the kingdom. It doesn't make you wiser or more virtuous. And I want to tell you something. I think the networking advantages are also overstated. And to some extent, to have these really smart, able kids go to colleges, the University of Maryland, or go to local colleges and stay in the area and stay in their towns, I love that. I love the idea that these resources are there, that you have the possibility for local institutions being sustained. So I'm conflicted again about that.
Okay, we're just gonna. You're right there in the 4th row. Can we get a mic, Seth, in the red shirt?
I had an epiphany while you were talking. And it came down to the question was, in the age of economic inequality how does it coincide with internet and social media? Well, that's how I wrote it. Because social disconnect on the local level is my answer. And what that means is people, when they text and talk to each other on the phone, whether it's 2 friends or married people or whatever it is, I see in New York hundreds of them, and also in my small town, they are connecting on their own levels. They're not connecting to the community. They're not connecting to the local needs. So there's no need to join a local community because they are connecting.
Okay, great.
And that destroys the local support groups.
So how does the internet and texting, both institutionally but also locally in families and communities, affect what it means to live in America today?
I'd like
And
to hear
also,
George
one more
talk
thing,
about
the
that.
media
We have to-
ignores them because they're texting to each other,
Okay.
and the media doesn't even hear them.
I have not had nearly the experience you had, and I'd like to hear about it.
Well, I mean, I'm kind of a, the celibate talking about sex here because I don't tweet. I'm not on Facebook. I've deliberately stayed out of the world of social media, not out of a sense of superiority, but because I'm afraid it would enslave me. Because I see my friends tweeting every 37 minutes, and those minutes are gone. You can't get them back. So, and it also cuts you off from the physical world, I think. That to me is, in New York, one of the truly alarming things about the iPhone. I've got it right here, which is people crossing the street with their face in their phone. How many times have I had to put on the brakes in order not to kill them and wanted to kill them? So I'm not going to scold, the 20-somethings for, texting 10,000 times a month. But I would say that, in Silicon Valley, there is an idea among some of the prophets out there that this is the new way of organizing society. It's called peer-to-peer networks. It's called, electronic civic engagement. There's a group called Coding for America, which is trying to fix basic problems in government through coding for municipalities, but which also thinks that you can fix politics through coding, that it's an engineering problem. And I think it's not an engineering problem. And I don't think peer-to-peer networks have enhanced democracy. I think they've created cliques. So I'm skeptical of internet, social media as a way toward democratic renewal. I see them as tools, and I use them all the time. The internet part, at least, and too often, too much. But they're just tools. They're not substitutes for or new forms for democratic engagement. I don't think.
We have a nice segue, a Twitter question that's been passed to me, which is, how has racial inequality resulted in corruption of opportunity and success? And I thought maybe both. Oh, and I thought maybe both of you might want to. Yes. How has racial inequality resulted in the corruption of opportunity and success in America?
Well, if we're talking about trend lines over the last 50 years, which is what I'm talking about, then insofar as it's a problem, that problem has been getting smaller. There is no way to say that you can remotely compare the degree of racial inequality in 1960 and the degree of racial inequality in 2014. So I think it would be incorrect to say that we've seen these problems growing that I'm talking about, that George is talking about, because of racial inequality. And I will, by the way, take a chance to respond. Why did I talk just about whites in Coming Apart? It was partly so that I could take away a whole lot of these ancillary issues and put them on the side and say, even after you take away the possible confounds of race and ethnicity, you have these very, very disturbing trends that have gone on in the United States that cannot be blamed on that.
I was thinking maybe Kendall might want to say something. His thought on that.
I did not come here to shoulder the burden of racial representation. Everyone in this room is implicated in the politics of race, even in this putatively post-racial moment. But I would simply say that it is a fact that most Black and most Latino kids of whatever class go to schools where most of the other students belong to the same race or ethnicity, right? We live in an age of legal equality, but I think for all these pockets of social equality that do exist in our society, these social equalities persist in public education, the radical defunding at every level, which has occurred with the consolidation of neoliberal capitalism as a form of governance, not just as a way of organizing our economy, but as a form of political governance. I'm sure many of you in the audience read the series in the New York Times recently about all of these young people who bought into, I use that phrase advisedly, bought into the notion that if they could get an education, they would be able to achieve class mobility, and now they're paying off astronomical loans. Why? Because we as a society have decided that it's just not important to invest in the education of our young people. So there, and you know, the largest population of prisoners, increasing population of prisoners are young women of color. So, I mean, if you look at education, if you look at incarceration, if you look at employment, unemployment in 1963, black unemployment in 1963, August of 1963, when the March on Washington occurred, was 10%. When the March on Washington occurred, if it was a march, I think of it as a neoliberal spectacle. In 2013, black unemployment in the United States was 13%, right? So we're not living, the story that we need to tell is not a story of inevitable and singular and continuing progress. It is a story of uneven development, and given the multiple insecurities that characterize the lives of people of color in the United States who have disproportionately suffered from the Great Recession, I think it is important in comparing to hold on to both ends of the chain. Yes, things on the whole are better than they were in 1960, but things for many people of color in the United States are as bad, and indeed in some places, we could even say, given the level of immiseration, worse. That's just a fact.
I love it.
I agree with every word of that, and I also have a train to catch.
Yeah,
so.
we have about 10 minutes, and then you have to, or do you have to run sooner? It only takes 10 minutes.
How long does it take to get
10 or 12 minutes.
We'll stay. Yeah.
Charles?
I just two quick points. The statement that there are a whole variety of indicators on which African Americans are worse now than they were in 1960 is absolutely correct. Alongside that truth is that if you look only at non-Hispanic whites, the problems that George and I are talking about have grown enormously. So if you want to say they're even worse when you add in everybody else, there is some truth to that. But if all of the racial aspects of the problem go away, you got a big problem anyway that has nothing to do with race.
Okay, we have time for, we're going to get George to his train, so we have time for two questions. One right up there. And we'll keep, I need you to keep your questions short. No, here, Claire?
I heard it said up here that the problem is that the rich don't understand the poor anymore. I think it's that the rich don't have empathy for the poor anymore. You pin the lack of understanding partially on this like cultural bubble, and I see that to mean that like there's an issue with the way that the upper middle class is constructing and approaching reality. And this seems to me to be tied to our American conceptions of individualism and success, which encourage the upper middle class to blame the poor's economic standing on personal failures and character flaws, which to me encourages a lack of empathy, what you call a lack of understanding, and is detrimental to the building of community in this country, which seems one of the other things that I think everyone was talking about, the fact that like community in America is falling apart. So I guess my question is, how do you think these conceptions of success, the way that we think of individualism in this country, and I guess the whole host of old American values that are still in our cultural imagination, playing a role today and kind of being detrimental in some aspect?
A lot of what you said, I used the word empathy too. It's important for the cabinet secretary to be able to empathize with a truck driver, and you do that by having certain kinds of experiences with them. I guess that I don't see the millennials sitting around saying, "Oh, it's their own fault that they're poor. They aren't working hard enough. They've done this." On the contrary, what I see in I shouldn't say millennials, 20, 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds. The politically correct way to look at this is to not blame the victim and to downgrade completely the idea that personal behavior has anything to do with it. That's what, when I go on college campuses, I don't know of any audience I've ever talked to where college students thought anything except that it is wrong to blame the victim for their problems. Instead, you've got 30-somethings who are rising to positions of authority, who are running the country, and so they have all these nice, sweet, compassionate thoughts about the poor. They just don't know any poor people. They've never had any personal contact with them. They don't know what life is like in Middle America. They have lived in these bubbles. We've actually got the worst of both worlds. We've got a new upper class that thinks it has all the right ways of thinking about poverty and sympathetic, wanting to help and all that. And they're absolutely clueless about the real nature of the problem.
All right, we'll take one last question. In the back, in the middle there. Yeah, stand up and we'll get a mic to you. Please keep it short. We have to get George to his train. Yes. I'm sorry.
Hi. Okay, so my question is about how do you rationalize the contrast between freedom and this idea of responsibility toward community that the panel is about, or to abide by the moral American ideals that Mr. Murray was talking about, which to me seem inherently binding or, not free, like constricting. I'm curious about this because the way I understand freedom in its purest form is that it's not part of any larger structure or organization, because then you're not acting freely, but within a framework with a constant goal or motivation that you're very much bound to rather than free from. And so that's kind of, for an analogy with the principle of altruism in biology, where, in order for the population to succeed, the individual must sacrifice their own freedom to contribute to the whole. And so I'm just wondering how you see these two existing together in America cohesively.
Could I answer? I've been hanging out with anti-surveillance activists writing about them, and their definition of freedom is privacy, essentially. And that's not my definition of, and that may be what you're kind of getting at, like, let me make the decisions. Free agency. My definition of freedom in the context we're talking about today is self-government, and that carries just as many obligations as it does rights, and just as much responsibility as liberty. I think that's maybe Hannah Arendt's theme in On Revolution. So I guess I would just suggest that it depends on what you mean by freedom, but that's what I mean by freedom.
Charles, I was wondering what how you would answer that. I mean, is libertarianism, as you understand it, about privacy? Is it about being left alone, or is it about self? I mean, could you speak about? Because I think that's how some people today think about libertarianism.
Yeah, I know they do, and I call myself a libertarian because if I say I'm a classical liberal, nobody knows what I'm talking about. I am a devotee of Adam Smith, not just of The Wealth of Nations, but also theory of moral sentiments. And basically I'm saying something very similar to George. Self-government, starting with government of the self, is absolutely central to freedom. And in theory of moral sentiments, what Adam Smith talks about constantly is the way in which people are interconnected. So to believe in freedom isn't to say that we're all going to live on our mountaintop alone. It is to say that we are free to live our lives as we see fit, as individuals, as families, and as communities. So that's the way, I define libertarianism exactly the way I want to define libertarianism.
I think we have time for one more. Is that all right? Yeah. Let's do it right here in the front. Can you keep it very short? What? No? Very short. Very short. Right here. Quick question. Stand up. Come on. Question. No comment. Just question.
I'm just wondering if you think that there ever has been a time or will be a time in which these sort of American ideals that we talk about in such a grandiose manner will be available to everyone. Because we talk about the 50s and
That's a great question. Thank you.
I think that the trajectory of American history was that we were making progress. That we started out with the almost Shakespearean tragic flaw of slavery, which compromised the moral authority of the Constitution. But that over a long time, we made progress. We were constantly moving in the right directions. And I also, it's amazing how much I agree with George. When he characterized in some ways...
But I'm not a libertarian.
Yeah, I know. It's only a matter of time. That since the 1960s, there have been certain dimensions, especially involving minorities and women, where there has been great progress. But there have been a variety of other ways in which a lot of those ideals have degenerated. What would be nice is if we could make progress on all of those, and I'm afraid that's not going to happen. I think we've moved off onto another path.
Okay, to leave with the little note of hope. Last night, Zephyr and Roger and I were talking about 100 years ago, and I think there are many analogies to the themes we've been discussing today to America at the turn of the 20th century into the progressive era. And back then, there was tremendous despair about corruption, about big corporations, about corrupt governments, about the decline of virtue, and this was the theme of the politics of the progressive era. And there was no single top-down national solution. It happened all over the country, in a newspaper here, in a settlement house movement there, in a muckraker over here, in a crusading candidate for office, in a populist idea for reforming the way senators were elected, and didn't happen quickly either. It took a long time, but there were many reforms that ended up creating what I think was a great period in American history, the period essentially from Roosevelt to Reagan. And since then, I think things have taken some bad turns, but there's a sign that history, can provide answers if you know where to look for them.
So great. Thank you very much.